Well, speaking of false promise, let's get right to Joe Biden and his administration, who Joe, remember, ran against white supremacy and also to follow science, which is why we have this Title 42, which as very helpfully that ring light was getting my eye there a little bit. Very helpfully, Title 42 uses COVID flim-flam about keeping people safe from a virus to keep out immigrants. Mm-hmm. And it's really galling. We talk a lot about how much Jen Psaki is not your friend. You shouldn't celebrate her, even if she dunks on like a Fox News anchor's son, who's now a White House reporter. But that, speaking out of two sides of her mouth with regards to, you're doing this to keep them safe, or is it because they're disease-laden immigrants, a la exactly what Stephen Miller was arguing that you supposedly ran against? But of course, I think the useful thing, again, about having Democrats in power is that they have to own the stuff, and they can't just fundraise lacrimosely off of it when Trump does it. But it's very frustrating. I don't know if you have anything you want to say. I watched Tucker Carlson, not as I usually do, on the Twitter feed as people post the most objectionable things he says, but actually live last night. And he had a chyron on that said, "Nobody can defend this." And that's interesting enough. I mean, you'd be surprised how much Biden supporters can defend it. They blame it all on Trump, right? Trump put us in this position, he forced our hand. And we'll talk a little bit about what Trump actually does owe to this, but it's all pantomime. It's all, as they say, kayfabe, a favorite word, because Biden's giving them exactly what we want. There's a story now before we came on air that Biden is going to reopen Guantanamo. He's looking for contractors that speak Creole so that they can open a detention center for Haitian refugees instead of processing them like refugees and also just helping them settle in this country. It's really... It's really galling for me because Tucker Carlson, everyone's pissing on Joe Biden, right? Rightfully so. But this thing where Tucker says no one can defend this, and then what he wants is not to let Haitians in and not to normalize a process where we allow these people to settle in and even just hear out their claims of for refugee status. Instead, he wants us to lean on Mexico to stop them in the water before they get to land, basically. And essentially, Biden's done something similar to that. So they're all getting basically what they want. And what we need to get to somehow is not only like a revocation of Title 42 and an understanding of what it was, the cynical, racist, sort of white nationalist fence of a policy, a wall of a policy that it was, and affirmatively just welcome people to this country.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about. I think maybe in a little bit we'll get to the striking images, but like let's start with top line. What people should understand here is that, as you were saying, Matt, it's like, yeah, it's amazing to see how much this becomes, sorry to use a cliche term, like a political football, right? For each side to sort of point at the other. And Matt's right to point out here that what Tucker Carlson is arguing for, what the right wing is arguing for, is not some kind of humanitarian policy, but an even more extreme and brutal one. A lot of it's political theater because this one is pretty close to as brutal as it can get. I mean, the images that we've gotten are striking, but these things don't happen in isolation. And just to give some people some context as to what's happening, the majority of these Haitian migrants are folks who were displaced in 2010, right? People who, because of massive purposeful disinvestment in Haiti, massive purposeful corruption within the government in Haiti, because the United States was trying to make sure that any kind of left alternative did not come into power, because they wanted to use the island as a place for cheap labor.
Yeah, to make Levi's.
Like that creates a crisis in a society that has caused mass displacement, right? You see the earthquake, right? Obviously, that's a natural disaster. But the other side of the natural disaster is when these things become, man-made. So, basically, these folks who have been displaced for a very long time are trying to get into the United States because they're thinking and they're buying into the media narrative that, oh, well, the bad man's gone, Trump's gone, and now they're going to be met with a humanitarian policy at the border, which they have not been. And, so like that's the kind of historical reason as to why, this large group of migrants are there. But there's two things that really need to be noted. What is Title 42? For people who are not familiar, this was something that was put in place by Donald Trump at first on the advice and pressure of Stephen Miller. Remember that nasty ghoul? As a way to get around typical international law when it comes to processing and accepting asylum seekers.
Notice Jen Psaki said our laws, not international law.
Yeah, exactly. Laws that we're all too willing to, the United States loves international law when they can sort of throw it at their enemies and use it to sort of beat the chest and to talk about, land invasions of Cuba. But when it comes to actually, owning up and living up to those standards, it's all about the good old USA, right? And our laws. But listen, like, understand this. Like, so Title 42 is something that Stephen Miller is trying to use to circumvent international law in relation to asylum seekers. And what is Title 42 specifically? It is basically saying that in the interest of the public health, you can deny people the right to asylum or the right to enter the country, to basically prevent a pandemic. Now, it should be noted that when Stephen Miller was pushing this, it was before COVID-19, before the COVID-19 pandemic, and rather he was trying to cite, some small outbreaks of mumps amongst, migrant communities as they were headed to the U.S. border. Of course, the coronavirus became a perfect opportunity for Trump to basically put in on a large scale that policy. And that became a hardening of the border that was already militarized and hard in the first place under Trump. Notably, and this is the reason that progressives in the left and even Democrats, even just like typical centrist Democrats should be pissed about this. If you went out and you voted for Biden to, stop putting kids in cages, to stop the horrible images that you were seeing on our border, this is a complete slap in the face because not only are these policies continuing, but, the Biden administration is advocating in court for them not to be overturned. So when we're talking about Title 42, we're talking about something that, yes, has its origins within the Trump administration, but it's not one of these things that's just like, oh, it just fell upon Biden, right? And it's
right.
like, oh, he's trying everything he can do to eradicate it. No, he wants to be able to use it, and you're seeing it from the messaging of Psaki and from the DHS.
That's the really key point. This is a choice. The Democrat leadership has basically decided that they are going to be one of the people who really takes notice of Stephen Miller's Twitter feed these days. Mm-hmm. And they follow basically, and they'll give those people exactly what they want. Like, this is policy. This is a conscious choice. And that's why it's so, when Biden says like, yeah, because Charlottesville and all this shit, like, dude, you're doing it. Like, Joe Biden is doing it. And so this is what the message should be for like the complicity in the Democratic Party in this sort of white supremacist policy, basically.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, this is thing is like there's like a mosaic of issues and history to sort of like, I don't know, untangle here, right? And that might be a tortured metaphor, but you know what I'm trying to say, mm-hmm. right? There's a lot of different factors at play, right? One is like the big political theater, right? And the big political theater is like, oh my God, Greg Abbott and the Republicans are attacking Trump for his weak border policy, right? And Biden is very happy, honestly, I would imagine, to accept
they're attacking Biden for his
criticisms. Sorry?
You said attacking Trump, you meant attacking Biden for the...
Oh yeah, excuse me. Yeah, sorry. Attacking Biden. And Biden is very happy to like receive some of those criticisms because it makes it seem like he's doing everything that he can, and it is like the mean and cruel Republicans who are behind this.
Good point. It's exactly like Open Borders Joe, because Hannity now is saying some Haitians are being resettled, like some are squeaking through the cracks. Like, it's just really revolting stuff. And Biden, like you said, that they're scratching each other's back with that.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And like, the images of the DHS agents on horseback around the migrants are horrifying, and so is what Abbott has done, which is basically build a wall of like SUVs on the border. Which, if you wanted any kind of like metaphor for like the piggishness of this country. It's a wall of suburbans.
Unbelievable. Let's see if I can find some photos of that.
But while you're pulling it up, I mean, the thing is though, is that like, again, like, so there's that kind of like theater that's what the people who are just gobbling up Fox News and MSNBC are getting two different hues of that fight. But again, it's a false struggle, and we'll get into some of these things later. That like in fact, Biden has ramped up a lot of these anti-immigrant policies, and there's a really good call to action that we'll get to in a second. But I also wanted to make sure that we're noting regarding Gitmo. Not only is that just a disgusting concept, right? Just as a metaphor, right? To be bringing in people whose country has been destroyed through neoliberalism, the IMF, and particularly the United States State Department, are trying to flee, but also that, and you can see those images there of the cars. It's just absolutely horrific. And Gitmo, obviously, like you can imagine why it'd be horrific, but people should also remember that there's a history of Haitians being brought to Gitmo. George H.W. Bush was doing a similar thing when Haitians were fleeing via boat to come into the United States. And people who were held in Gitmo, specifically on the assumption, right, or the reasoning for was that they might have HIV/AIDS. And those conditions that people were held in were absolutely subhuman. They are a disgusting stain on this country. And just the thought of bringing anybody there, let alone Haitians who have already, felt the effects of what a United States refugee camp looks like in Gitmo, is absolutely despicable for anyone to do, let alone somebody who was, again, running on sort of ending the barbaric policies of Donald Trump.
So the way that we get into pedantry in these sorts of topics too is very dark. Yeah. The whole it wasn't a whip, it was a rein that they were using to lash people while on horseback. It's the exact same thing as, is it a concentration camp? Isn't it? What is technically a concentration camp? Like, really, a retreat to pedantry to basically make this that kind of a word game instead of what this is, which is mass brutality and just cruelty towards people who are looking for something that we should be able to provide them.
Drop the reins from the picture. Like, you Photoshop that out of there, right? And that picture is still horrifying.
Of course.
Do you get what I'm saying? Right? It's like, I don't want to digress too much. Just like, I think your point on Twitter about that was 100% on, right? This is the most ridiculous thing to be trying to, correct folks on. Yes, do I think that like the vast majority of Americans, specifically people who haven't grown up in like rural areas, understand like the fine aspects of like horsemanship or horse riding?
Yeah.
Yes. Do I think that this is the moment right now to try to push some insane lesson on folks, to try again to throw cover over barbarism on the border? You Photoshop those reins out of there, so there's no question about people being whipped, and that photograph is exactly has the same kind of moral weight. It's people on the ground, scared, trying to run, and being met with a huge animal and a police officer on horseback, right? When they should be being met at the border with food, with clothing, and with tickets to places to go in the United States, for them to be resettled and to be invited into this community. We have enough space. We have need and demand, for working people in this country in the first place. We have plenty of space and opportunity for people in this country. That to be meeting 14,000 folk at the border like this is just absurd. Yeah. It's just beyond absurd on like a moral level, but even like on a really cynical, like nuts and bolts, like political economy level, we absolutely can be inviting people into this country and would frankly benefit from having more Haitians, not just because of, for a million reasons, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, I could keep going, but I feel like I'll just get more and more angry, but
yeah, let's do this because there's a call to action that we can do that I think is worthwhile. Right. If you don't mind pulling up this Truth Out piece.
Yeah.
And this was written actually before a lot of these images were coming out, the fights over Not that the fight over 42 wasn't going on beforehand, but they were before it sort of had reached the head that it had. This is in truth. That was an op-ed. A number of immigrants detained by ICE has increased 70% under Biden. Just scroll down a little bit. I want to get their name too. This is by Silky Shaw, who is one of the organizers of Communities Not Cages, and we will put some links to people for how to participate. It's going to be an action that's going on in over 20 cities. But this was written before, a lot of this horrifying stuff with Biden, and it rings even more true. The first line is, when President Biden took office, the number of immigrants in federal custody was at a 20-year low. There was an opportunity to roll back the system, but Biden chose to maintain the status quo of previous administrations. Within a couple of months, jail beds started filling up again. And then they talk about why they organized this march. If you go down a little bit, Matt, there's a paragraph that starts, with Joe Biden in office, there's a growing perception that immigration enforcement is less lethal, but the numbers tell a different story. The numbers of immigrants jailed by ICE has increased 70% since the start of the Biden administration. And we continue to lock up children, nearly 15,000 daily, in large-scale facilities and military bases. And now we're talking about reopening portions of Gitmo to hold people again. These conditions have been exacerbated by the pandemic. ICE has done little to keep COVID-19 at bay, spreading infections not only inside immigration jails, but also in surrounding communities into other countries through the deportation of thousands of immigrants. And that's a really important point, honestly. That the threat of COVID from immigration is not from immigrants, but from the damn ICE agents themselves.
Yeah, and also we stopped testing them as we expelled them, which even puts further to the lie Psaki's bullshit about trying to keep everybody safe.
And then people should really check out this entire article because it's filled with a lot of important facts here. But it's a little bit later in the piece. It starts on the campaign trail. On the campaign trail, President Biden lamented the separation of families by Trump and committed to, quote, stop corporations from profiteering off of incarceration, which is an amazing thing to be pointing out again, as not only are they talking about reopening Gitmo, but as Matt mentioned, they are looking for private contractors to be providing much of the security, logistics, and translation services, right? So that's a complete walk back from that policy. Just so people are clear, by the way, though, regarding Gitmo, it's something that the administration is exploring, and hopefully the political backlash that they have already seen will prevent this from happening. But you should remember, that's where their heads are at. That's what their reaction is, regardless of if it comes to fruition or not. Early on, the administration rolled out reforms to limit deportations and undo Trump's worst policies. But as the border has become a top news story and an easy target for right-wing attacks, Biden has faltered. Meaningful progress toward dismantling immigration detention has effectively ground to a halt. The continued persistence of immigration detention, despite growing consensus that it's unnecessary and wasteful, shows how much easier it is to build up and expand the system and infrastructure than to roll it back. And, they go on to note some of the early things that seem to be very, beneficial. But this is a call to action. This is a call to make sure that people are not, ignoring what's going on. You're certainly seeing Democrats, typical Democrats, being very happy to go on Twitter, honestly, and just see how people are responding to any of these stories of the horrors at the border. And you will not be able to tell the difference, frankly, between the typical Democratic suburban voter and a Republican. They're saying things like, what would you want to do with them? Send them back. They're a threat to this country. We're full, right? And these are people who stand with her and we're very happy to vote for Joe.
Absolutely.
This is one of those things where sometimes you can forget. I don't know. I talked about this yesterday during the stream. On the left, it's sometimes there's a fixation where it's okay, well, do we have all of the numbers to do everything that we need to do? Sometimes it's just as important to be leading and fighting these kind of battles in conversation and making the demands, articulating them, and then having people come and join you rather than just hoping that organically everybody's going to understand what's going on and sort of side with you.
I am 100% in agreement with that the exact dynamic. It doesn't matter at this point about this sort of topic. First of all, and I mean, even if it did, you might be able to make an argument with how welcoming Americans are about this stuff, even despite constant propaganda about how fucking dangerous they are. But yeah, like, I think you're exactly right. Like, that shit has to go out the window. And like, and it's also a way where, like, yeah.
No, I mean, you're 100% right. And maybe, like, you know, to sort of end this conversation, I think that, you know, we were talking about this a little bit beforehand. And again, we're not trying to get in flame wars with anybody. So, you know, maybe we'll skip names, but like, there's Matt and I have no fears about, for example, tying Biden to these nasty kind of things, right? And I do think that there is a kind of cruel and bitter irony in the fact that the kids in cage, the No More Kids in Cages camp in the Democratic Party become very silent once Biden comes into office. Yeah, but I do think that sometimes people on our side, we can become a little bit of poisoned by, you know, the fact that there's so much hypocrisy around this kind of stuff that you forget your, like, first and foremost moral duty, which is to be standing up for people against injustice anywhere, but particularly injustice done in your name. And if your only reaction to these kind of horrors is just like, but what about Trump, right? You know, just trying to own the libs. I think it might be time to walk back a little bit and you know, and reassess, you know, if you know, owning the libs has gone to such a point where you're not able to just see the very clear moral picture here and to advocate and to look for avenues for something to do. Because, like, the fact is you're 100% right. The Democrats aren't doing it. The liberals aren't doing it.
Newsflash.
Us just sitting there and pointing at them for not doing it instead of trying to advocate for something different, or at least be critical on the merits of the plan instead of just pointing out the hypocrisy in general. That's also a glaring mistake as well.
Because I think it sort of naturalizes and excuses almost and defangs any sort of attempt at shaming them into doing anything remotely better. And I mean, if they don't, this Gitmo thing, it's obviously worse. And it's obviously like an example, one of many, which, surprise, when Biden won, it didn't mean that we were going to humanize the border. So yeah, like, and I think anybody who was selling, like, vote for Biden based on that, they should be shamed. And good, make time for that conversation. But that's not, like, the only reason to, like, do that small thing on voting day, right? Like, and to always bring it back to that conversation, I don't think it's that interesting, because I think, like, if Trump was in office right now, I'd be like, yeah, I like the guys on horseback. And then Joe Biden would be like, you know, I wish I would have won, and go to Joe 30330 and give us $25 a month, and next time we'll really get him. And it's like, no, I think the clarity is somewhat useful, even if the cruelty is the same.
Yeah, I think that's 100% on point. And again, I just put it into the notes on Twitter. If you're watching this or listening to it, the website is detentionwatchnetwork.org. I'll say that again, detentionwatchnetwork.org/take-action. National Day of Action 2021. Probably be easier just go to the homepage there. But on September 23rd, tomorrow, there are going to be actions all around the country, and it might be useful to show up to those if you are able.
Yeah, and tag us if you do that.
Yes, that'd be wonderful.